Questions to the Prime Minister. Mr. Dennis Skinner.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure the whole House will wish to join me in paying tribute to the servicemen who've fallen since the House last met. Lieutenant Andrew Chesterman of 3rd Battalion, the Rifles, Lance Corporal Matthew Smith of 26 Engineer Regiment, and Guardsman Jamie Shadrake of 1st Battalion, the Grenadier Guards. We send our deepest condolences to their colleagues, their friends, and their loved ones. Their courageous and selfless service to our country will never be forgotten. Mr. Speaker, before listing my engagements, I would like to say on behalf of the Government, and I hope the whole House, one word about the huge success this summer of the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games. I want to send all our congratulations to the superb performance of Britain's athletes and Paralympians. I want to say a huge thank you to the volunteers who put such a smiling face on these games, and a large well done to all of the organisers. I think they made the entire country proud, and as they promised, they have indeed inspired a generation. This morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others, and in addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Mr. Dennis Skinner.
Is the Prime Minister aware that this cabinet reshuffle of his B team hasn't raised a ripple with the general public, whereas on the other hand, those loud boos that greeted the Chancellor will haunt the posh boys forever? Why doesn't he be a man, do the decent thing, call a general election?
Very good to see the honourable gentleman back in such good form. I'm sorry that when I was forming my government of all the talents, I couldn't find him on my speed dial, but I have done something that New Labour never managed. I have taken a miner and put them in the cabinet, and they're running the railways. I thought he'd appreciate that.
Nadine Dorries. Order that. The House must calm down. Nadine Dorries.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, you will be aware that the Deputy Prime Minister of the Liberal Democrats reneged on a promise that in exchange for referendum on AV, they would deliver boundary changes. I wonder if the Prime Minister could answer, if the Deputy Prime Minister goes to him and says that in exchange for state funding of political parties he would deliver boundary changes, what would the Prime Minister's answer be?
Well, I'm not in favour of extending state funding. I think it's very important that all political parties work hard to attract members, to attract donations, and frankly, when we get those donations, we pay credit to people for funding political parties, which is in the public interest.
Ed Miliband.
Mr. Speaker, let me join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to Lieutenant Andrew Chesterman of 3rd Battalion, the Rifles, Lance Corporal Matthew Smith of 26 Engineer Regiment, and Guardsman Jamie Shadrake of 1st Battalion, the Grenadier Guards. They all died serving our country. Their sacrifice will never be forgotten, and our thoughts are with their family and friends. I also want to join the Prime Minister in paying tribute to everyone involved in the Olympic and Paralympic Games. Our athletes, our fantastic volunteers, and indeed the whole country that united in support of Team GB and came together. It did show our country at its best. It brought Britain together, and we should all be proud of the achievement. Yeah. Mr. Speaker, after 2.5 years in government, the Prime Minister returned from his summer break and told the nation that he now realised it was time to cut through the dither. Who did he have in mind?
I must say, he's had all summer to think of a question, and that's the best. Is that really the best he can do? Let me set it out for him. Let me explain what this reshuffle is all about. It It is not that there are two economic departments in our country, the Treasury and Business. I want every single department to be about the economy. I want the Transport Department building roads. I want the Communities Department building houses. I want the Culture Department rolling out broadband. I want the Agriculture Department backing British food. This is a government that means business, and we've got the team to deliver it.
Mr. Speaker, he mentions the reshuffle, and of course it's good to see the Chancellor still in his place. I have to say to the Prime Minister, he's come up with an ingenious solution to the problem of his part-time Chancellor. He's appointed another one, the former Justice Secretary. Mr. Speaker, it's a job share. We'll see how they get on. Now, I don't know if he remembers, but a year ago, he published his National Infrastructure Plan alongside the Autumn Statement. And he said at the time of that plan, it was an all-out mission to unblock the system. So can he tell us, 1 year on, of the road building projects announced in that plan, how many have actually started?
Well, first of all, I'm glad he mentioned the issue of chancellors, because, of course, I have got my first choice as Chancellor. He's got his third choice as Shadow Chancellor. Yeah. And apparently he still has to bring him the coffee every morning. That's just how assertive and butch the Leader of the Opposition really is. Now, he asks about infrastructure. He asks about infrastructure. If you look at what is planned by this government between 2010 and 2015, we will be investing £250 billion in infrastructure. That compares with just £113 billion between 2005 and 2010. That shows he's absolutely not got a clue.
The difference between the Shadow Chancellor and the Chancellor is the Shadow Chancellor was right about the economy and the Chancellor was wrong. And look, I have to say, Mr. Speaker, the Paralympic crowd spoke for Britain. Now, of course, characteristically, it's another Prime Minister's questions. We're back. He doesn't answer my question. The answer is none of the road building programmes announced in his grand infrastructure plan have started. Now let's look at another grand claim he made. In March, he published his housing strategy, and he said, our housing strategy is beginning to get Britain building again. Now, before he starts talking up his next announcement about housing, let's look at the effect of the last one. Can he tell us, since his announcement, how many houses have started to be built?
Housing starts are up 30% since 2009, which was the lowest rate of house building since the 1920s. That is what his government left. Now, he praised to the Gunnels, his Shadow Chancellor. Let us remember, it is the Shadow Chancellor who landed us in this mess. With the biggest mess. Who was the City Minister when the City went bust? The Shadow Chancellor. Who was the man who gave us the biggest budget deficit in the developed world? The Shadow Chancellor. That is what that team has delivered, and that is why British people will never trust them again.
Mr. Speaker, I think sometimes he forgets. He's been Prime Minister for 2.5 years. He's got to defend his record, and he can't defend his record. Now, of course, again, he didn't answer my question. I asked him about what had happened to housing starts since he made his announcement. The reality is, housing starts have fallen since then and are 24% lower than they were a year ago and lower than they were at the time of the last Labour government. Now, so another grand claim that hasn't materialised. Now, let's talk about planning. In March, after 18 months of consultation, he hailed his flagship planning policy, and he said it was the biggest revolution in 60 years. But on Sunday, Mr. Speaker, he said he was frustrated by the system and the hoops we have to jump through, and he wanted to change it again. Mr. Speaker, how is the Prime Minister so incompetent that he brings in a flagship planning bill, calls it a revolution, and then 6 months later says it's not fit for purpose?
The national planning statement we inherited from Labour was over 1,000 pages. It is now down to just 52 pages. We have radically simplified the planning system, something he should be praising rather than attacking. But he might want to notice that today, the World Economic Forum has come out and said that for the first time in a decade, instead of Britain going down the world competitiveness ratings, we are back in the top 10 and rising. And let me read what they said. The United Kingdom continues to make up lost ground in rankings this year. Lost ground that happened under the last Labour government. Now, there's a reason for that. It's because this government is cutting regulation, cutting corporate tax, taking people out of tax, getting our businesses moving right across our country, investing in the Regional Growth Fund, delivering more apprenticeships than any previous government. That's what we are delivering. What has he done over the summer? Where are the policies on welfare? Nothing. Where are the policies on education? Nothing. Where is the great plan for our economy? His only answer to a debt crisis is to spend more, borrow more and put up the debt.
Back to the bunker, I'm afraid, after that one, Mr. Speaker. I noticed, I think the Crimson Tide is back as well. Now, Mr. Speaker, over the last 2.5 years, we've seen announcements on infrastructure failed, announcements on housing failed, announcements on planning failed. Now, what's the reason for this economic failure? The reason is that his fundamental economic approach is wrong. After the summer, we now know that in his whole 2.5 years as Prime Minister, the British economy has not grown at all. So why doesn't he admit it? The real problem is this. Plan A has spectacularly failed.
Well, let me tell him what is actually happening in our economy, which is you're seeing the private sector growing and expanding. There are 900,000 more people employed in the private sector than there were 2 years ago. We are now a net exporter of cars and motor vehicles for the first time since the 1970s. You're seeing the fastest rate of business creation that you have seen for decades. That is what's happening. Our economy is rebalancing. There is growth in the private sector. Our exports to China up 72%, to India up 94%, to Russia up over 100%. That is what is happening. It is a hard road, it is a difficult road, but we will stick to that road because we will deliver for the British economy.
Mr. Speaker, we're in the longest double-dip recession since the Second World War. How out of touch does this Prime Minister sound? And I have to say to Tory members of Parliament, if they go to their constituents and start trying to blame everybody else, they've been in government 2.5 years. It's happened on their watch. Now, Mr. Speaker, we saw a reshuffle yesterday. He brought back the member for Yeovil, who'd been sacked. He promoted the Culture Secretary, who should have been sacked, and he left in place the part-time Chancellor that the whole country knows should be sacked. It's the same old faces, the same old policies, a no-change reshuffle. Mr. Speaker, if he really wants to cut through the dither, there's no place like home.
The big difference in British politics is that I don't want to move my Chancellor. He can't move his shadow Chancellor. The fact is, in spite of all the economic difficulty, this is a strong and united government. And in spite of all the opportunity, this is a weak and divided opposition.
Order! 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 There is going to be more, and it's going to be from a knight, Sir Malcolm Bruce.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wonder if the Prime Minister has seen today that PwC have produced a report saying that Aberdeen needs to recruit 120,000 skilled people in the next 10 years if we are to deliver our capacity in the global energy economy. Will the government take steps to ensure that an energy academy and the necessary support infrastructure for training is put in place so that we can deliver growth for the United Kingdom?
Well, I think my right honourable friend raises a very important point, which is the growth of the economy around Aberdeen, obviously linked to North Sea Oil, which has been extremely successful. I want to see that continue to expand, and I'll listen very carefully to what he says and what the British government can help to provide that extra capacity, which I've seen for myself.
Geoffrey Robinson.
Can the Prime Minister confirm that we learned over the summer that the UK has borrowed £9.3 billion more in the first 4 months of this year than it did in the corresponding period last year.
We have cut the budget deficit by a quarter in 2 years. But obviously it is immensely challenging to get the deficit down. But I would just note that Labour's answer to getting the deficit down is to borrow more, to borrow an extra £200 billion. The one way you cannot get borrowing down is to put borrowing up.
Nicola Blackwood.
Mr. Speaker, my constituents were delighted when BMW announced £250 million to increase mini production and called their Oxford plant the heart and home of this great British success story. Does the Prime Minister agree with me that this kind of inward investment is vital to kick-start the economy and that we must do more to prioritise policies to make the UK more attractive to investors?
Well, my honourable friend and I have neighbouring constituencies and many constituents who work at BMW at the old Cowley Works, and it's very good news that BMW are investing another £250 million into that plant. That's on top of the £500 million announced last year. That is safeguarding over 5,000 jobs in the Oxford, Swindon and Hams Hall plants. It's part of a huge recovery story for the British motor manufacturing industry. We are now net exporters. That hasn't happened since the 1970s, and it's a huge credit to Jaguar Land Rover, to Nissan, to Toyota, to BMW, to all those companies that are investing and choosing Britain. And they're not choosing Britain because of the weather, they're choosing Britain because we've cut corporation tax, because we're investing in apprenticeships, because we're investing in the infrastructure they need, and they know that this is a country open to business.
Alison McGovern.
Poor Wirral families face the indignity of food banks, and Save the Children are launching their first ever public campaign for British children. What's the Prime Minister doing to help?
Well, what we're doing is making sure that we target help on the poorest families in our country, which is what we've done through the tax credit system. But at the same time, I think we should praise all the voluntary and big society effort to help the poorest families in our country as well.
Stride.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would my right honourable friend join me in paying tribute to the 23 million people in our country who work with such commitment in the private sector, the sector that generates the wealth of this country so desperately needs? And would he welcome, as I do, the fact that under this government we now have more people employed in the private sector than at any time in our history?
I think the point my honourable friend makes is very important. If you actually look at the figures and include all of the financial sector, there are more people employed in the private sector today in Britain than at any time in our history. And what you've seen, the Shadow Chancellor says that's because we're in recession. What it is, it's because companies are choosing to employ people and the private sector is getting larger, and that is good news. Employment is up 201,000 this quarter. Unemployment is down 46,000 this quarter. The claimant count has fallen. The rate of unemployment is down. Youth unemployment is down. I would have thought the whole House would welcome those figures.
Last Sunday, the Prime Minister told us there should be no more excuses for failure. So given that his policies have produced the longest double-dip recession since the war, without put down, borrowing up and a collapse in consumer confidence, is his failure to apologise because he doesn't take his own advice, or because he considers that a record of astounding success?
This comes from an honourable lady who served in a government which, after 13 years, delivered us the longest and deepest recession since the war, and gave us the biggest budget deficit virtually any country in the developed world had. Now, of course, it takes time to get yourself out of a hole as deep as the one that was dug by the Shadow Chancellor and the Leader of the Opposition.
Gavin Williamson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the summer, Jaguar Land Rover announced the creation of 1,100 additional jobs at their Castle Bromwich plant. This is in addition to the 750 jobs they're creating in my constituency of South Staffordshire. Does my right honourable friend agree there is a stark contrast between the rhetoric of the last Labour government about reviving the automotive industry and the actions and the delivery of this government?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. In the last 2 years, Jaguar Land Rover has hired an extra 8,000 new workers. That is a massive success story for the West Midlands, a massive success story for a great British brand, but let's also say so, a big success story for massive inward investment from the Indian parent company. We should praise all of these things and recognise we've got to do even more to make Britain a really business-friendly country with low rates of regulation, low rates of tax and lots of support for apprenticeships and infrastructure. That is what we are delivering on this side of the House and will continue to do so.
Timms.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Hundreds of young people from outside Europe chose London Metropolitan University confident in British higher education. He needs to tackle visa fraud, but will he lift the threat to deport students who've paid their fees and complied fully with all the rules? Why is he so damaging the standing of British universities around the world?
I know that the honourable gentleman speaks with considerable experience and obviously wants to speak up as well on behalf of his constituency. I have to say, having looked at this case and looked at the action that the border agency has taken, it does seem to me there was some real abuses going on. What I want to see is Britain open to students, and let's be clear, anyone who can speak English and who has a university place is able to come here and study at our universities. But quite rightly, the Immigration Minister has been very hard in terms of closing down bogus colleges and making sure that good universities like this one, if they're not meeting the rules, they have to take action. That must be right if we're going to control immigration.
Richard Harrington.
Is my right honourable friend the Prime Minister aware that in Watford, in the last quarter of 2012, where the numbers have just come out, 327 new companies were incorporated? This is a record. This is way beyond anything else in history, and I think he would agree with me that it shows the government's policy for encouraging private enterprise is succeeding.
My honourable friend makes a very important point. As I understand it, 2011 saw the fastest rate of new business creation of any year that we've seen in decades. And that's what our economy requires. It does take time, it does take patience, because we need a massive rebalancing away from the public sector towards the private sector. We need to see other industries, not just finance and retail, succeed. We want to see that business regeneration happen right across our country. This rebalancing takes time, is difficult, but is the only long-term way out of the economic difficulties that we were left by the party opposite.
Paul Blomfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister is right to celebrate the most extraordinary Paralympics that we've seen and are seeing at the moment, and the exceptional achievements of Team GB within those games. What will he then say to Baroness Gray-Thompson and to the other Paralympians who have warned this week that his decision to cut disability living allowance will prevent disabled people participating in sport and threaten the legacy of the London Games?
Well, first of all, the message I would give to everyone in Paralympics GB, of course the separate team to Team GB, is a huge congratulations for their massive success in the Games. I think it has been truly inspiring being able to either watch on television or the privilege I've had of going there myself in person is to see absolutely packed stadiums for the Paralympics. Not something everyone expected, but I think something that says a lot about our country and about our people, and they'll be great for the Paralympics. Now, answering his question very directly, we are not cutting the money that is going into supporting disability. We are reforming the system, replacing disability living allowance with the personal independence payment, and it's all about recognising people's needs. It has been worked up with the disability lobby very, very carefully, and I think it'll be improvement on the current system.
Mark Garnier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister, I know, is well aware of the lack of capacity at Britain's airports. But will my right honourable friend, though, in seeking to resolve this problem, please take consideration of the opportunity presented by regional airports, such as those in Birmingham, that can help rebalance the economy?
No, I think my right honourable friend makes a very good point about regional airports. Let me be very frank about this. These very large infrastructure projects are extremely difficult for individual governments to take and to deliver. I think what we need to do is build a process that hopefully has cross-party support so we can look carefully at this issue and deliver changes that will address the problems of capacity that we'll have in future years and that address the issue of the hub status of the UK. I'm hoping to make an announcement about this over the coming days, but I think it's important that we work across party lines because this won't happen unless parties actually sign up to a process that can deliver.
This is Anne Maguire.
Mr. Speaker, I just wondered if I could cut through the waffle that the Prime Minister gave us in the answer to disability living allowance. The reality is that 600,000 disabled people will be losing an extra cost benefit. Instead of just giving warm words to disabled people in this country, why doesn't he take aside his immovable DWP secretary and say to him, it's time we thought again on this one?
The move from disability living allowance to personal independence payments has been an exercise of huge consultation with the disability lobbies to try and make sure that we get this right. The fact is there are hundreds of thousands of people on DLA who've never had a recheck since they started to take on that benefit. There are many others on disability living allowance, and I know this as a parent who filled out the form myself, who have to fill out reams of answers to questions without any proper medical check that would actually get them the benefit quicker. So we're moving from an old system that's out of date to a new system that will actually help disabled people.
Harris. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Selective dorsal rhizotomy is the name of an operation that allows children with spastic cerebral palsy, like my constituent Holly Davies, leave their wheelchair behind and walk independently. It has been conducted successfully thousands of times in the States, but it's only available privately in the UK, as NICE refused to allow the operation on the NHS. Will the Prime Minister look at this situation and help me and the families are currently raising money for their children to have this operation across the country, get NICE to change their mind?
Well, I will certainly look closely at this. I quite understand, as I said a moment ago, as a parent of a very disabled child who had cerebral palsy, if there was anything you could do to get that child out of the wheelchair, as a parent, you'd want that to happen. I've looked at this case. NICE actually says that it's this operation is a treatment option for some children and young people, but it does caution against the potentially serious complications because it is an irreversible operation, and so there are risks involved. But I will look very carefully and see if there's anything more that NICE should consider.
Mr. David Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whenever the Prime Minister is facing an industrial dispute in this country, he always advises the trade unions to go for reconciliation, for arbitration. In the interest of fairness, can I ask him to speak to his new Health Secretary and say, would he involve himself in the dispute at Northumbria Healthcare and ask their board to do what the unions are asking and refer their dispute to the NHS Staff Council for resolution?
Well, the new Health Secretary will have been listening carefully to that, and I'm sure he'll be able to discuss it with the honourable gentleman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think it's very important that motorists have the right to renew their car tax at the post office. Not everybody has internet access. The DVLA contract is up for renewal soon. Will the Prime Minister please make sure that that contract stays with the post office?
Well, I think the honourable gentleman, my honourable friend, makes an important point, particularly representing, as he does, a very far-flung rural constituency with people living across a number of different islands. I'm sure the Business Secretary will have been listening carefully to what he says, although there's a limited amount of interference into contracts like these that the government can make.
Gavin Shuker.
Does the Prime Minister have full confidence in his Police and Crime Commissioner in Hampshire?
What I'd say about the Police and Crime Commissioners is we haven't yet had the elections. We're going to have elections in November. I think it's a very good opportunity to broadcast from this House what an important set of elections these are. I want to see a new form of accountability coming through our policing forces, and I think it's an excellent reform, and I'm sure one that many people want to turn out and vote, and I hope vote for their local Conservative candidate.
Mr. Andrew Percy.
Mr. Speaker, over the summer, a number of communities across Brigg and Goole, including Swinefleet and Crowell, suffered flooding, and we were flooded in part because our drainage dikes are not cleared out because drainage boards fear prosecution under conservation habitats legislation. Will the Prime Minister meet with his new Environment Secretary and take away this threat of prosecution so that drainage dikes that were built and dug to protect property can do their job?
No, well, as someone who represents a constituency that has frequently been subject to very bad flooding, I know how many frustrations there can be in local communities when things that need to be done don't get done quickly enough. Sometimes that is the fault of different agencies, sometimes it's the fault of landowners, sometimes local authorities. All sorts of issues have to be crunched through, but I'm sure the Environment Secretary would have been listening very closely to what he said.
John McDonnell.
Will the Prime Minister confirm with no ifs or buts that there'll be no third runway at Heathrow Airport whilst he leads his party?
Very clearly, while I do believe we need to establish a form of review that will bring parties together and make a decision about airport capacity, I will not be breaking my manifesto pledge.
John Barron.
Speaker, a letter from and meeting with the Secretary of State for Defence has confirmed that the 2nd Battalion, the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, is the only battalion that should not have been cut on military grounds. Instead, what did for the 2RF was the additional criteria that regimental losses be capped to 1 battalion, thus saving more poorly recruited Scottish battalions ahead of a Scottish referendum. Would the Prime Minister kindly meet with me and other MPs from across the House to discuss this issue?
I'm very happy to arrange perhaps a meeting between my honourable friend and the Defence Secretary and other interested members. Look, I think it is right to see the Army change in its structure, not in its overall size, because of course with 82,000 regular soldiers and 30,000 territorials, the Army won't be changing in its overall size. It was difficult and it is difficult to do that in a way that respects regimental traditions, cap badges and issues that I know a number of honourable members hold very dearly. And it's important that we do that across the United Kingdom. That is what the government has set out to do, but I'm very happy to arrange that meeting.